the cloud. I have gotten a couple of things of folks saying that they're having trouble getting on. If folks let me know, I can send them, email them a link that seems to be working. I don't want to go test it on a separate link because I don't want to accidentally close the whole meeting. So let me know if you've heard of folks. Maybe we'll send them.
All right, so great. So folks, if you're trying to do attendance, we're going to ask you to do attendance after the Hudson River Park Trust report, which is what we're going to get into right now. Hopefully everybody had a chance to read the report, and because it's also in the chat, but there's some really, details that everyone should read before the meeting. And I'm also hoping that everybody had an opportunity to review the CV4 recording that I posted on YouTube. It really will help our conversation if you have, because Venetia, who's from Con Ed, is with us, as well as Mr. Frank Bomo, and they're going to be giving us a similar presentation, but things can go a little bit more high level if everyone has been able to see it. I don't know, can everybody raise their hands who's had an opportunity to take a look at it in this, if you just want to do it with your raise hand function, if you're able to do that. Let's see how we've got a few. Yes, great. Some folks did some good homework. Great. Okay. Michael, I know you're working hard over there. Did you get to review it?
Yeah, a little bit. How many is that?
I would say we have about a dozen or so, but quite a few.
12, 13. Thank you.
13. Okay. Anyway, so you can put your hands down right now. And the idea here is, let me just open up a little document. 1 second. Put this here. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Robert, who's going to give us an update on construction, and the oysters are growing 2 inches, and just off of memory, all the different wonderful things that were in that report. So go ahead, Robert, and tell us about all the wonderful things the trust is.
I'm actually going to pass this right over to Noreen, who has our piece and should whiz us through it.
Can you all hear me? Great, and you can see the screen? Screen 2?
Yes, we can see the screen.
Okay, great. So we all have a lot of construction happening these days. So I thought I'd start by showing a few recent photos of some of the things that are underway. Hi, everyone, by the way. Pier 84 dog run. This is a long extant dog run on Pier 84, just south of the Intrepid, that, to be honest, was looking a little bit sad and a little bit colorless. So this is a capital reconstruction project that we undertook beginning this summer, and we just reopened it last week. It has not grown in size, but it has grown in color and in features, including some new water features for the dog run users up there. There was a nice, quiet little opening, no ribbon cutting, nothing formal. Just we invited our neighbors and friends to come be with us, and we were very happy to have some of our elected officials join us as well. Chelsea Waterside, this project you've all seen before. We are undertaking basically a reconstruction of the areas that were not improved a couple of years ago. So basically everything but the playground and the basketball court. Happy to say that construction is going very well here. We are building for the first time ever a comfort station. We are reusing repurposed stone retrieved from on-site for the cladding of the building. That's what you're seeing here. The building is a portal into the new athletic field, and it straddles basically the athletic field and the picnic area. And it will have solar roof panels, and it will be putting any excess power back into the grid. So we're very pleased with this. We are working on the dog run. We had hoped that it would be open before now. There were some supply chain issues basically related to fencing. However, we will be reopening the dog run. We expect round about September 23rd. Stay tuned for that. that you're seeing the sprinkler pad there on the right-hand side, and the picture on the left-hand side is a little kind of maintenance closet for the supplies that people who clean the dog run daily need. Here you are seeing more repurposed stones, in this case to surround the future picnic area. That was one of the desired community elements here. And that's about it for Pier 97. We can talk more if there are questions about any of these projects. Sorry, that's it on Chelsea Waterside. Pier 97 at the northern end of the park at 57th Street is also going well. Here on the right-hand side, you are seeing the shade structures. We're happy to say that the shade really provided shade. We were there on a very hot day last week, and it was comfortable. And then you're also seeing on the left-hand side some of the stonework that is underway. Here is the all ages slide that will take people from the elevated Belvedere down to the grade level towards the western end of the pier. Obviously not in its finished, smooth, slidable condition. And on the left-hand side, you're seeing a portion of the sunset deck. And on the right-hand side, I was there last week on the day when they were putting the first bits of dirt down for the future sunbathing lawn, which slopes and has a very nice angle so that people will be able to relax and enjoy the water views while they're sunbathing. At Gansevoort, I don't have a lot of pictures here, but basically on the right-hand side, we put in the salt marsh plantings last week, or many of them. And to the north of the salt marsh over the summer, we installed additional habitat enhancement features, basically the reef balls and oyster gabions, in this case in a different kind of array than was the case in the Tribeca Park area. But that aspect of the project, inclusive of about 20 million juvenile oysters, was installed over the summer. On the south side of the peninsula, the work on the steps that are the kind of signature feature, along with the kayak ramp on the south side, is also well underway, and that work is expected to be done in the fall. And on the western side, the future 13th Avenue Promenade is more or less in shape, inclusive of many plantings. And if you walk north or south, or if you're on Little Island, you can see many of those plantings and trees that are now in place. At last week's meeting of Community Board 4, we gave a kind of surprise announcement that we were able, we believe, to find a location for some interim pickleball courts during the course of the community discussions for Pier 97. After we had pretty much already conducted the community process, a group of pickleball enthusiasts showed up at Community Board 4, and we met with them and talked with them about the need. Obviously, since then, we and the whole earth has seen about the continued growth of pickleball as a popular sport. And so we've identified an area in our composting yard basically right now where we can compress the our own park operations and have space, we believe, for up to 4 pickleball courts. This is very much an interim use. The whole area of Hudson River Park between 29th Street and 44th Streets is essentially mostly still unimproved. And so this is characteristic of the types of improvements that Hudson River Park has made to various park areas over the years while we're waiting for money or design or construction to begin. And we hired an on-call landscape architect team recently that will be vetting our measurements and the layout, and developing construction documents so that we can do public procurement on this. But the goal would be hopefully to have pickleball courts in place in use at some point next summer. Otherwise, we have a few other updates as well. Tennis courts, we've mentioned this before, but we are redoing the 3 tennis courts that are just south of Pier 40. We expect that the tennis courts will close for the public on September 19th, thereabouts, and they'll be closed for a few months while we undertake not just putting a new surface on them, but the structural base below it so that the surface won't crack, and doing other odds and ends cleanup jobs on that. So September 19th, roughly, closure of the tennis courts. The Google crosswalk that we've discussed previously is underway. That work began in August and will be continuing for another couple of months or so. We are expecting to award the construction contract for the science play area in Tribeca at our September board meeting. And we have been at work interviewing design teams for the future estuarium, for which we do not yet have all of the funding, but we did make a decision to advance the design process earlier this year. So we expect to be awarding the design contract for the estuarium. We hope either late this month or at the next board meeting. We received 27 proposals in response to that RFP. Incredible teams have been working down from a short list, and I expect a lot of public engagement for that design process, consistent with the types of things that some of you have seen more recently for Gansevoort and Pier 97 and Chelsea Waterside, but with some additional stakeholders here. Events, I won't go into detail on them, but it was a very busy summer. We are still in the midst of events. A couple of highlights of some of the public events are that we had 13,000 people at our Blues Barbecue event, which was fantastic. It was on Pier 76, and it's the first time in memory for that event where it was not hazy, hot, and humid or raining. And it was really a wonderful occasion. Jazz at Pier 84 grew in popularity. The dance festival, Healthy on Hudson, there were about 5,500 people, I believe, doing Healthy on Hudson throughout the different piers that we hosted it at weekly all summer long. Very, very successful summer of programming. Same goes for our environmental programming. We can have a fuller discussion about programming at a future meeting. I know tonight the goal was to keep it brief. One last thing that we put in our report, because I think this advisory council might be interested in this type of thing. It was a summer of a lot of graffiti. We spent over 300 hours just in July and August removing graffiti from various places in the park, largely concentrated in Tribeca and Greenwich Village, but in other cases as well. The recently restored private passage, the sculpture that we showed you the last time at Clinton Cove, that had its glass porthole kicked through, sadly, one night about 2 weeks ago in the middle of the night. Difficult summer, trying to keep the park clean and looking good, but I think our team did a great job, and we remain on the case as weather is still beautiful, and we expect a lot of people to be using the park, obviously, all fall. And I'm happy to answer questions, Daniel, but you may not want that, whatever you want.
You know, you mentioned in your trust report a survey, an online survey that you might want to share with the advisory council. Yes,
very much so. Robert, you look like you're wanting to jump in on that.
Yeah. So we are, folks probably have seen it. It's in the park a lot. We probably have met some of our surveyors. If you've been at any of our events, we are doing some survey of our park users. We have, I think I've shared it with folks before because we've talked about it before, but I will, we're doing another push again this fall, sort of post Labor Day. So I'll send over a link and an email and some messaging that everyone here, we would love if you could share it with your lists, if you could share it with your community members. We're looking for kind of anyone who uses a park, anyone immediately adjacent to the park, just to tell us a little bit about how they use the park, how often they get here, how they get here, all those sorts of good things, so that we can really start trying to pull that information together. I know this group in particular, a lot of our tenants and users, would be helpful if we can try to capture some of those as well.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, we do have a big discussion that's coming up. So if you have anything crucial that you want to ask the trust, you can always reach out to Robert, email him, I recommend. And you can copy me and we'll make sure you get an answer. But I would like to move on to the main portion of our agenda, which we're going to be speaking about Pier 98. We're going to be hearing from folks representing Con Edison. We'll be hearing from Tom Fox, who's an advisory council member and member of City Club. And we'll also be hearing from Hudson River Park Trust. If you don't know, it is not a lawsuit yet. It's a 60-day notice. City Club has asked for some answers and made some allegations that were actually pretty well discussed in CB4's meeting last Thursday. And I've invited Jeffrey Lefrancois to summarize what he learned as a member, as the chair of that community board. And then we're probably going to be hearing the same presentation from Con Ed this evening. as at a high level. We're going to listen to all the presentations, and then we're going to open up for Q&A after everyone's had an opportunity to speak. So stick with us. It was a great conversation last Thursday, and I look forward to another great conversation today. But hold off your questions, write them down, and we'll field the questions to individual organizations at the end after everyone's had a chance to speak. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Jeffrey, if you would mind giving us a summary of what happened last Thursday.
Sure, thanks, Daniel.
I'm sorry, Dan, did we talk about City Bike? That was on my list.
Oh, right. So the Google Crosswalk. Yes, that is on your list.
Okay, great.
Briefly, there's going to be a relocation of the City Bike station from where the construction is going on by the Google Crosswalk, south of Houston, near the tennis courts, and it's going to be moved. And this is, I don't know if this is definitely happening, but it's a temporary move that's going to happen by Morton Street. Is there something else you want to talk about with that?
It's not definite, but City,
Not definite.
City did have City Bike out. They were initially thinking fairly positive thoughts about it, but they hadn't confirmed it yet.
So that's a temporary one. They are also possibly interested in trying to make it permanent, but that involves a larger study. They were trying to move on advancing the temporary approvals for the temporary one as much as possible. On the trust side, we are also looking at trying to change around the construction to the maximum extent possible. This is for a tennis court reconstruction to shorten the amount of time that it would need to be disrupted. So we're trying to try to get at the problem from both directions. We know how popular the City Bike rack is.
Yeah, and I mentioned too, Robert and I had a conversation about this about a month ago, is that we often have the Port Authority vehicles parking there, and we're hoping that we can get them to stop looking at the sunsets. They're not there today. No, they're not, but I'm right across the street from it. But they often do kind of hog that area, and it would be great to ask them to stay away if they don't need to. I had a question for you, Robert. Are they getting there via Pier 40 and driving up the Esplanade to park there? I mean, there's no other way to get there in their big vehicles, because you can't really get onto it from the highway there. So they must be going up the Esplanade.
I'm not certain of that. I can get back to you. What we are looking at is the possibility of one of those gates that you may have seen that we have in the park in various places, because State DOT had identified this company Barrier One as one of the security measures. So we've been looking at ways to facilitate movement and fewer sugar cubes in various places by looking at more gates. So that's just a general theme. But I can get back to you on that, Daniel.
All right, thanks. So let's move on to Jeffrey. Everything good for you, Michael? Okay, great. Jeffrey, let's.
Thanks, Daniel. Hi, everybody. Happy September. Last Thursday, feels like a lot longer ago than that. Tom, you probably agree. CB4, our Waterfront Parks and Environment Committee, had its regular meeting, and on the agenda was the Pier 98 topic of discussion that really came to the fore earlier in August after a New York Times story and the notification of a potential intent to litigate based on environmental concerns on Pier 98. It was Board 4 thought it was a robust and informative discussion. When I was talking with the co-chairs about getting this on our agenda and getting invitations out to Con Ed and DEC, and I was curious as to whether or not they would even come, given the New York Times story and the threat of litigation. And to the contrary, they were there, provided what I thought was a very extensive amount of data. And even after a lot of discussion about environmental concerns, many on the committee seemed relieved based on what was shared. I know there is still more that is working on being shared, including some clarifications from DEC. And at the end of our discussion, really the thrust of it was a call for continued transparency to all three entities. And by three, I mean DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, which is the state entity that regulates utilities. The utility in this case being Con Edison, who operates the pier and who operates the facility on Pier 98, who also has a lease with Hudson River Park, the third entity in the docket, because nothing can be simple as it relates to issues on the west side and in the park. So that was the thrust of it. We had folks there from boathouses. We had folks there from environmental groups. And in fact, on our committee, we have folks from the boathouse at Pier 96, as well as a lot of parents who recreate with children in the area. And I have to say that I went in my first meeting with Con Ed ready to, guns blazing is not a good term, but really get hot on it, because there were some major concerns. But as more and more data has been shared, there's still cause for concern as it relates to, I think, just information around how piers like this affect our waterways, and in particular, the marine estuary. But we saw it as a really good starting point for a conversation. The committee was made aware that this meeting was going to be happening tonight. And I think I will leave it at that, because I know there'll be others to share more on it. But in the end, they voted to send a letter requesting that the three entities come back to CB4 once a bit more information has been sort of figured out how to share and disperse. DEC has made some final decisions as it relates to the permit. And I know there were some questions about existing water data versus the water that's being tested that's going out. So I will leave it at that unless anybody has questions specifically about the CB4 meeting, and pass it back to you, Daniel.
Can you repeat that last part of what DAC has done what?
The greater call for transparency across all three entities.
Okay.
And
You said
that
DEC has made something.
determination on the permit.
Okay. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm just going to make an announcement once again. If you could go to the chat, if you haven't signed the attendance form, please click the link and sign the attendance form. Next up, we're going to be hearing from Con Ed, who is with us. DEC was unable to find someone to join us today, so we won't be hearing from DEC, but Con Ed and DEC work closely together. So Venetia Lannon, who also spoke at the TB4 meeting, as well as Frank Cuomo, are here to educate us about what's going on at Pier 98 in terms of discharge and water and all those fine engineering things. So you guys have the floor. And if you need to share your screen, just let me know.
Yeah, that would be great, Dan. And maybe while Frank shares the slides, I'll just say thank you to you and to the Advisory Council for giving us this opportunity to put the facts on the table. Again, my name is Venetia Lannon, and I'm the Vice President of Environment, Health, and Safety at Con Edison. And I'm joined by my colleague, Frank Cuomo, who's General Manager in STEAM. And we're here tonight to talk to you about our operations at Pier 98 and a notice letter that we received recently from Tom Fox and the City Club stating their intention to sue us and the DEC, the State Department of Environmental Conservation, and the Hudson River Park Trust for alleged violations of the Clean Water Act. So we're here this evening to review and to refute those allegations. We're also here to answer your questions and allay any concerns that you might have about the allegations. So Frank, if we go to the next slide, here's what we really want you to take away from our presentation. These are the key takeaways. But before I even get to the key takeaways, I just want to say this in plain English. The allegation that Con Edison puts contaminated water into the Hudson River at temperatures above allowed levels is false. I just want to put that out there. I also would like to make clear that we have a valid permit for our operations at Pier 98, and we operate in compliance with the permit. In the very rare instances where discrepancies have occurred, and we're going to talk to you about those in full transparency this evening, as required, we self-identify those and report them to the DEC through the EPA's electronic reporting system. And DEC has said they consider these instances to be minor. And for those of you who had hands up and had the opportunity to see the recording from the other night, you heard it from DEC directly that they consider these discrepancies to be minor. I used to work at DEC, and I can say for DEC to say that publicly, that's significant. So in addition to meeting our permit requirements, the DEC has required us to do additional water sampling that we'll be talking more about. And that sampling shows that discharge at Pier 98, with the exception of copper, and we'll be getting into this, would meet New York State's stringent water quality standards for activities like swimming, kayaking, and healthy fish propagation. I know those things are important to you. They're important to us. We know that we're working in a marine sanctuary, and we take our environmental protection commitments really seriously. Another key takeaway here is that water discharge temperatures on average from Pier 98 are 78 degrees Fahrenheit, levels within compliance with our DEC permit. We're going to talk more about that. Dan, we are going to try to keep it a little bit higher level, but we do just want to make sure that people have the facts here. And then our last key takeaway is that Pier 98 supports water-dependent uses and critical operations, providing power and heat to the West Side and Midtown Manhattan. So Frank, let's go to the next slide and we'll look at some of those critical uses. So, and if everyone could put themselves on mute, that would be great. I think there's a teeny bit of background noise, just so everyone can hear. So I don't need to tell the advisory council where Pier 98 is, but for those of you that don't know, it's at 58th Street on the upper left-hand, highlighted here on your slide. And right across, and it supports these two facilities, the 59th Street Steam Station, which is across the West Side Highway in yellow, and then down at the bottom left, the 49th Street Electrical Substation. So just a word about these facilities. Starting with the steam station at 59th Street, I personally think it's a very beautiful building, landmark 1904 building, uses natural gas to produce steam that's supplied to about 1,600 Manhattan buildings for things like heating, hot water, air conditioning. The facility also notably has the ability to produce 20 megawatts of electricity to support neighborhoods in the West Side. This is really critical during times of peak demand. You guys might recall a couple of weeks ago, everybody had their air conditioners going. During those times of peak demand, this plant provides backup so that we can keep the lights on the West Side. Turning to the 49th Street substation, been there in operation since 1978. It provides electricity to 9 local wet networks on the west side of Manhattan, serving about 80,000 customers, and critical facilities like the Lincoln Tunnel, the Port Authority Bus Terminal, St. Luke's Hospital. It's really, you can see others on the slide here, not an exaggeration to say that the operations at Pier 98 support some of the most important infrastructure on the west side of Manhattan. So let's take a closer look at Pier 98 on the next slide, both at our opportunity, our activities here, as well as sort of the planning context. So Con Edison has operated Pier 98 since 1959, certainly well before I was born, and is currently a tenant of the Hudson River Park Trust. We pay an annual rent to the trust of about $1.3 million a year. Zooming out to look at how the city in their waterfront revitalization plan considers Pier 98. They designate Pier 98 and the adjacent land underwater. I'm just going to pause there because I'm perfectly happy to keep going while there's.
I'm trying to mute people as soon as they join.
Okay, oh great. But I just really want to make sure the council members hear this. Okay, great. Thanks so much. Okay, so we're talking about the city's waterfront revitalization plan. They designate Pier 98 and the adjacent lands underwater as a priority marine activity zone. What does that mean? It means it's specifically intended to support maritime infrastructure and water-dependent uses. So on one hand, it is a priority marine activity zone for maritime industrial uses. And on the other hand, it's a marine sanctuary. And we take both of those things, as I say, very seriously. What's important about the fact that it is supports water-dependent uses is that each barge delivery that we take at this pier for fuel oil, which we'll talk about later in the presentation as backup fuel, literally takes hundreds of trucks off of the local roads each year. So just taking a quick look at the pier, I'm going to turn it over to Frank in a moment to talk to you in more detail about this. Let's start with the barges there that are sort of in yellow and black. These are the two berths. We have berths for 2 barges that, as I say, supply backup fuel oil during the coldest months of the year, which is really important to get, keep the steam going and keep the heat on. So the ability to take those barges is critical. We'll look at now the stars that you see on the screen. These are sampling outfall locations. We can also look here at the equipment in the middle is substation cooling equipment that Frank's going to be talking about. It takes water, and that's star number 3 on the bottom. Water gets pulled in there, gets run through the cooling equipment in separate pipes. It doesn't touch anything, and then it goes outfall 3 here. And we're highlighting these because we're going to be talking about these outfalls just so you have a sense of where they are and what they do. The outfall number 2, which is closer to the West Side Highway, that is a discharge and monitoring sampling station. We have continuous monitoring for pH and temperature that's monitoring the discharge that's coming out of the steam station across the street. Frank's going to talk to you about that. Also want to highlight something interesting here. SUNY Albany also has a temperature gauge on the pier as part of, we're hosting them there as part of climate change research to measure the ambient temperature of the Hudson River as our climate changes. And that data, it provides important context to this conversation. So just want to highlight that as well. So that's the pier. Let's move on. And I'll turn it over to Frank to talk about the operations that I mentioned, and then I'll be back to talk about the environmental elements.
Thank you, Venetia. Can you hear me?
All good.
Great. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Frank Cuomo, and I am the General Manager here at Steam Operations at Con Edison. We're here this evening, and I'm here this evening to give you a basic overview of our main operations associated with the Hudson River outfalls. I'm going to start with outfall 003. This is the outfall associated with our substation cooling equipment serving the 49th Street substation that Venetia described. Before I go any further, I really want to emphasize on the previous slide, the substation cooling equipment and outfall 2 that serves the steam station are distinct and separate. They are not interjoined. The only thing they have in common is they are both located at Pier 98. They do not intertwine in any way, and they are completely independent of each other. I think there was a little bit of confusion last week when we presented this. So I just wanted to make that clear up front. We're going to start with outfall 3, which is the substation cooling equipment serving the 49th Street.
I'm sorry, there's
substation.
still confusion. Can you say that again?
Yes.
What is separate?
So the substation cooling equipment on Pier 98, which is associated with outfall 3, is separate and distinct from the steam station on 59th Street, which is connected to outfall 2.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for clarifying. Okay. We're going to start with outfall 3, and we'll start at the pier, right? So we are at Pier 98. So this system is made up of 3 separate loops. So what does a cooling system even do? So this system is set up to cool critical electric transmission cables during the summer period. It allows our electric feeders to operate at higher loads and move more energy when our communities need it most, which is in the summer. The system doesn't operate all year long. It only operates approximately 118 days on average a year. And it's typically starts up in May and ends or shuts down sometime in October and November, depending on the year. To describe how it works, we're going to start here at the pier, and I'll describe the 3 separate loops that all work together to remove heat from these electric transmission cables and transfer it into the river just so our cables can operate at higher levels and provide the needed energy to the west side of Manhattan. So we start here. Loop 1 is depicted in purple, and this is the saltwater loop. And I really want to make it very clear, the river water does not leave Pier 98. It is a very, very short loop. It goes through a short amount of piping and heat exchange equipment before it goes back into the river. So all river water stays either in the river or on the pier. It does not leave Pier 98. I want to make that very clear up front. Heat is then transferred to our freshwater system, which is depicted in blue, and this travels down and down the West Side Highway or 12th Avenue. We can pick it up here on the next slide. It continues down 12th Avenue until it hits our substation on West 49th Street. Once it hits West 49th Street, there is a third heat exchange loop that works in conjunction with the middle loop, which is the freshwater loop, and that takes heat from the electric transmission cables and it sends it back to the river via the same route. To kind of see that all in one spot, this diagram shows a simplified version of that process I just described. The three loops work together to transfer heat from the electric transmission cables to the river without coming into direct contact with each other. Moreover, I really want to reiterate the river water does not leave the pier. All of the heat exchange happens in separate locations. The river water stays on Pier 98 and is discharged back into the river. It comes into contact, the river water comes into contact with very, very few pieces of equipment, mostly piping and heat exchange equipment. And it's a very, very short journey from when the water is taken in until when it is discharged back into the river. Again, I'll highlight outfall 002 is separate and distinct from what we just went over, the substation cooling equipment. Outfall 002 is associated with the 59th Street steam station, okay? I'm going to give you a simplified overview of what happens inside this landmark power plant. If we start at a very, very high level, the 59th Street station is one of 6 operating steam production facilities serving the Manhattan Steam Network. The station is one of our smaller stations, being approximately 12% of our overall capacity for the system. Most of the hours of operation occur during the winter periods. You can imagine when heating load is highest, that's when this station is online the most. Overall, if we look at the entire year, the station operates only 25 to 30% of the year. However, it does provide critical redundant capacity to ensure our customers have energy available 24/7, 365. If I go to the next slide, we have a simplified version of what you can see inside the station, what is actually operating inside the station. While the overall process can be quite complex, I'm boiling it down here to some basic, very basic and relatable elements. So first, the process starts with good old plain drinking water, the same that you would have in your showers, your sinks, your faucets. That same water comes into the station. In that water, the minerals might be good for our bodies and for us to drink, but our boil equipment would much prefer pure H2O. So at this point, we start with our filtration process. We filter the water to remove all of the natural minerals that are found in our drinking water. This is similar to how you might filter your incoming water with a Brita or water filtration type system as part of your refrigerator. Once that water is filtered and at the appropriate conditions, we can send it into our boiler where it is heated and converted into steam. You can equate this almost to like a steam tea kettle. Both of these processes pull minerals out of the water and transfer them to our pH balancing and monitoring systems. Here, the water is treated and monitored to ensure that it's within our permitted limits prior to discharging it to outfall 2. While I made this look very simple on the diagram, there are a number of stations, monitors, sensors, and even a dedicated control room and control room operator to coordinate this whole process and monitor it at all times when in operation. In addition to the main boiler equipment, we have ancillary supporting equipment such as drains and trenches and overflows that are routed through a water refinement process prior to being discharged to outfall 002. At the outfall, we perform continuous monitoring, as Venetia mentioned earlier, and report these values monthly to the DEC. That concludes my operational overview, and I'll turn it back to Venetia, who will review some of the major assertions associated with the citizen suit.
Thanks, Frank. So let's get right to them because we are very much looking forward to your questions. We go to the next slide, Frank. Thanks. So starting with assertion number 1, that the allegation in the notice letter that we received says that we're not operating with a valid permit. Con Edison operates at Pier 98 under a valid DEC permit. We've put our permit number up on the screen here for anyone who's keeping score at home, but we have what's called a state pollutant discharge elimination system permit, or a SPEDIES permit, and it's valid under the State Administrative Procedures Act, SAPA. We submitted a permit renewal back in 2016, an application for a renewed permit back in 2016 prior to our permit expiration date of our prior permit. As DEC was evaluating that permit renewal, we then in October 19 submitted a request to modify that permit to accommodate a process change at the 59th Street steam station. Again, I know this might get confusing. We're happy to take questions on this. As part of the permit modification process that we requested in 2019, that triggered DEC conducting what's called a full technical review. That full technical review takes time. And while the permit renewal date has passed, the permit is still valid and is extended under SAPA until DEC issues the renewed permit. So you can kind of think of SAPA as like an umbrella, which allows the DEC to take the time that they need to do their full technical review to evaluate the modification and the renewal that we're seeking. So if we go on to the next assertion, the second assertion is that we're operating in violation of effluent standards. Con Edison operates in compliance with permitted effluent standards. And for those of you who heard DEC say this the other night, you heard it straight from them, but I think it's helpful to read this quote from DEC to ABC News on August 24th. Since 2010, of the 4,400 sampling records at the Con Edison plant, DEC identified 27 reported exceedances and non-reporting of operational parameters unrelated to the outfall at the facility. These discrepancies were considered minor and quickly resolved. So the asterisk there is that DEC actually sent us an email a couple days later on August 30th, clarifying that the 27 total dings should really be 26. So let's take a look at what these exceedances and non-reporting incidents are. What comprises that 26? It's 8 pH excursions. It's 16 total suspended solids events, and total suspended solids in layman's terms is sort of like the water's cloudier than it should be, and 2 flow discrepancy events. We'll talk a little bit more about these high level on the next page, but again, just want to underscore we are required to report these to the DEC through the EPA's database, which we did, and DEC considers them minor and quickly resolved. So let's go to the next slide. Again, bear with me. This is just the one part, and then we don't want to get too into the weeds. But let's take a look at these excursions from our permit. So on pH, right, and there were 8 of them. 7 of them had to do with false readings that were due to low water. So the tide was too low, and so our gauge could not take an accurate reading. One of them was due to a local construction event. So putting those aside, the only one that actually was an actual excursion to discharge to the water for pH, there was only 1. Out of 4,400 records since 2010, there was only 1. And that was slightly over the limit for 48 seconds before the correction. Technically, this is allowed in our permit. So this is why you hear DEC saying they're not getting hot and bothered, if you will, about these exceedances because they are minor. With regards to total suspended solids, there were 16 of them. So 14 of those had to do with the fact that there was no flow coming from the plant on when we were scheduled to take a sample. As Frank said, 59th Street's one of our smaller steam stations. It only operates between 25 and 30% of the year, though critical. There are times when there's no flow coming to the facility, so we can't get a sample. We report that. That's what's called a non-monitoring event. So there were 14 of those non-monitoring events. And then we had 2 actual times when total suspended solids were outside of the limits in our permit. So, those are the ones that we should be focusing on. Again, finally, we had two what are called flow discrepancies for the same reasons. Basically, there was no flow when we were scheduled to sample. That isn't even a consideration in our permit. It's not even a foul, if you will. So I think really from the environmental perspective, in terms of what is going into the river, this is a molehill. And that is why you heard DEC say as emphatically as they did that these are minor issues, again, that were quickly resolved. So let's go to the next slide, to the next assertion.
I'm sorry, what does TSS stand for?
TSS stands for total suspended solids.
Okay.
And again, I think you can think of it like the sort of the cloudiness of particles in the water. But you can Google it too and learn more about what TSS is if you want. But total suspended solids, thanks for that question. So again, we do not return contaminated water to the river. The water discharged into the river meets or exceeds permit standards other than for these limited number of pH and total suspended solids exceedances. So I talked to you about that full technical review that DEC is doing as part of our modification. So when you modify a permit, DEC says, okay, we want you to look at everything coming out of these outfalls. We don't think that, none of these things may be part of your process. As Frank walked you through, our process is pretty benign, but DEC is very conservative and they say, we want you to look at everything coming out of these outfalls. They required us to look at 150 different chemical parameters coming out of our outfalls. And these are the ones that had detections: selenium, chromium, chloroform, copper, and lead were all detected. However, at such low levels that they would meet state water quality standards for activities like swimming, kayaking, and healthy fish propagation. Chloroform actually was so low that it would actually meet state drinking water standards. I think that's really important to underscore. Let's talk about copper. Copper was the one parameter that wouldn't meet the state's highest water quality standards. But it's coming out of outfall 3. And as Frank described to you, outfall 3 is basically, it's taking river water in, it's going through those pipes, it's taking on the heat, and then it's being discharged directly into the river. So actually DEC was kind of scratching their heads as to where the copper might be coming from because it's not part of our process. However, copper is something that is commonly found, like manganese and iron, in many of the rivers and lakes around New York State. So I think, you heard from DEC that they, that they consider these discrepancies to be minor, and that the additional sampling that we did for them would meet high water quality standards with that one exception of copper. So let's keep moving. We're almost at the end. Dangerously high water temperatures was the other assertion in the notice letter that we received. Con Edison does not return water to the river at dangerously high temperatures. Con Edison continues to meet the requirements of our existing discharge permit, and no readings have exceeded the permit thresholds. And we'll talk just a little bit more about that here. Over the past 5 years, and Frank's going to get into a little detail, then we'll be done. Over the past 5 years, the discharge temperatures for outfall 3 have averaged 78 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're talking about outfall 3 because that's the one with the higher temperatures. We're required to monitor at outfall 2, but we don't actually have a permit limit because, DEC is not concerned about the temperatures there, they're lower. The outfall 3 that we are presenting to you here, on average 78 degrees Fahrenheit over the past 5 years. The outfall 003 has operated with a discharge temperature at or below 90 degrees Fahrenheit 99.8% of the time. Pause. And the maximum temperatures have exceeded 90 degrees Fahrenheit 11 times and have never exceeded the 104 degrees Fahrenheit permitted temperature limit. I'm going to turn it over to Frank to talk a little bit more about those exceedances, 2 charts, and then we're done. Over to you, Frank.
Great. Yep. Thanks, Venetia. I'm going to really go over this quick because I think Venetia's talking points did a good job there. But what we did was we took the data for the last 5 years and we wanted to be transparent. So we provided it here, we plotted it. And as you can see, there's a couple of threshold limits there, the 90 and the 104 degrees. And you can see we really only peak for average daily temperatures once in 2019, over 90, which is the average for the day. Of those 11 occurrences that Venetia was discussing, they're pretty intermittent and they don't happen often. And the average time that they last is somewhere in the 3 to 3.5 hour range if they occur. And usually these occur during the hottest times of the year when the electric transmission cables need that cooling the most to ensure power is delivered to the west side of Manhattan without fault and without interruption. But again, we have never exceeded that 104 threshold. And remember, we're monitoring continuously. So we have a lot of data on this and a lot of temperature data to trend against. So really, and you can see, I mentioned that the system only operates 118 days on average a year. So you can see we're really only talking about, between May and November, depending on the year and the operation. So we're pretty comfortable with where the temperatures are and what we're putting back into the river is well within our limits. For completeness, we also included outfall 002, but as you can see, the temperature data really trends pretty close to what the river temperature is, just with some, it's a little bit warmer in the winter months because the station is probably operating more in the winter months. So you see there's a little bit of a gap between this dotted line, which represents the SUNY gauge, which is, ambient river temperature, and the temperatures coming out of the outfall. But outfall 2 pretty much tracks the river temperature, not too much a concern here as far as heat.
I'll just add, and we're putting the key takeaways slide here so you have them for your reference and as we open it up for Q&A. But just, one thing that's interesting about the SUNY gauge is that, it's about 80 feet from the outfall and you already see the temperatures dissipating like 4 or 5 degrees as the water sort of hits the river water. So that's sort of helpful to understand. I will also say for context that 100 degrees is about the temperature of a hot shower. So just to kind of put that in perspective, just to think about what does 100 degrees feel like. Again, we understand the sensitivity to the marine habitat, but just put that out there for your reference. So with that, we are happy to turn it back to you, Dan, to take it from here. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so thanks very much. Everyone's going to have an opportunity to ask questions, but we're going to let Tom and HRPT speak first. Tom Fox is with City Club. He's also a member of the Advisory Council. So Tom, if you wouldn't mind unmuting, I believe you have a presentation, so you should be able to.
Yes, I sent it, Dan, if you have it.
I may have. Do you want me to share my screen or do you want to do it yourself?
Okay, I can bring mine up. Okay, it'll be, I do the whole screen. Is that it? Nothing but the screen? So I'll help you out.
Yep, you would just share your whole screen. If it doesn't work well, I can always open it up myself.
Okay, here it is. Now, how do I share it?
Okay, you have it. So you see the share screen button on the bottom?
Share screen button on the bottom.
It's in the middle of your the Zoom meeting interface.
Of the Zoom meeting thing. Okay, not on my screen. Hold on.
Well, you're going to want to share it and you want to select the monitor that you're using.
Share screen, got it. And select desktop. I don't know. I thought you were going to be able to do this. So
okay, I can share my screen. I have it.
If you don't mind.
Sure. Let me put it in presenter view. There we go.
And I'll just have to ask you to advance, and they go pretty quickly because I don't have this.
Yes, so I'm just gonna go ahead and
Polished.
share my screen and it's there. I haven't heard it well, but do you see it? I see it's both. Okay.
We've
Great.
got it.
So I'll try to follow along with you, Tom.
Great. I realized when I introduced myself at CB4 that not too many people actually know who I am, but I just wanted to give you a short thumbnail. I'm a park professional for the last 47 years as a ranger at Gateway, an early leader in the city's community gardening movement, a founding co-chair of the Brooklyn Bridge Park Coalition. I designed an award-winning greenway that was in National Geographic in 1990. And I was the founder of a 120-member organization whose membership ranged from the Amateur Women's Soccer League and the Metropolitan Softball Association to the Regional Plant Association, Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and Roadrunners Club. Next. On the west side, I lived on Bank Street for 8 years in the late 70s and became an active Westway opponent. I'd be careful what you wish for. I was appointed to the West Side Task Force, and we recommended that the highway move onto the land and become a boulevard with an esplanade. I was again appointed to the waterfront panel, both times by Governor Cuomo, which ruled out landfill and platforms and proposed the park. I helped negotiate the first MOU that included $200 million in city and state funding to start the park. And I was the founding president of the Conservancy, initiating inter-improvements, negotiating the Chelsea Piers lease, and completing the plan for the park. Next. I was a member of the alliance that spent 2 years negotiating the 1998 Act, a founding member of the original Friends when it was a watchdog. It actually sued the Department of Sanitation and removed facilities from Gansevoort in 97, which got a $21 million settlement for the park. I was a co-plaintiff in the now Little Island suit, which generated $176 million to complete the park. I'm a board member of the City Club, and I'm an author of a new book that's coming out next year called How the West Was Won and Lost. Rutgers University is going to print that next year. When I started this, I realized I should let you know my perspective of the other person who's presenting, which is Venetia, who I've known for probably 12 years. A colleague, Suzanne Matai, was replaced as the head of Region 2 for being, quote, too environmentally friendly. And the Bloomberg administration proposed a replacement, Venetia Lannon. She said she worked for DEC, but she didn't say she was the regional director for 6 years. She also joined the Cuomo administration as a deputy secretary for the environment, where she oversaw DEC. So for 9 years, she was responsible there. Next slide, please. This is just a chronology. EDC, 8 years, DEC, 5 years. And then she went to New Jersey for an engineering company for 2 years. And now she's returned to represent the corporation that she used to regulate. Next. So what's the timeline here? The timeline is in December of 2010, DEC got $5 million settlement for multiple violations of the Clean Water Act from Con Ed. They gave $4 million to the trust. In March of 11, the trust released a public notice for the pier, but didn't mention water cooling or outfall discharges. In May 2011, 2 EDC employees came on board. Venetia became the regional director of DEC, and Madeline Wills became the president and CEO of the trust. They worked with one another. Venetia had worked for Madeline at EDC. So 2 months later, the trust signed a 30-year lease for 98, which did mention cooling water and river discharges. And between January of 2011, when Venetia came on board, and June of 2022, there were 26 violations of the type that had resulted in the $5 million fine levied earlier, but there was only one notice of violation by DEC and not a single enforcement action was taken during that time. Next. We do have quite an extensive response to their claims, which are selective information and misrepresentations to make you feel very good about what they do. Basically, they do not have a valid permit. It's technical, and we're not going to argue any legal or technical issues because everybody's eyes will glaze over, as mine have, because I've been dealing with this for the last 2 months. Con Ed's permit was validly extended until May of 2021. You notice that's not 2022. Even if there was an existing permit, they're operating outside of the permit activities because they've changed their procedures and several of the outfalls without modifying the permit or issuing a public notice, which is required by law. But DEC hasn't done any enforcement. I don't know why. Despite their kind of saying everything is a minor discrepancy, it's actually a violation of the Clean Water Act. Clear and simple. Next. The characterization by DEC and Con Ed that these are minor violations, but they're repetitive, it reflects that DEC is not enforcing the permit conditions. We've seen that a number of times here. It's not taking its enforcement authority seriously. And the fact that the SPDES permit, which is basically a permit to pollute, had 7 violations in the past year, but there's no notice of violations even being issued by DEC. Wonder why they're asleep. Based on the records provided, the only enforcement action in the last 10 years has been an informal notice of violation, which was never followed through on. Next.
I'm sorry, in terms of recording notes, you said there's 7 violations, but no violations have been recorded. I'm sorry, I don't know how to.
No violations have been, no, DEC has not issued, next, back to the last slide, please, sorry. All these slides will be available for you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I'm back to this previous.
Okay, thank you. So the only enforcement action DEC has taken was an informal notice and no follow through on that notice. Next slide, please. This is a few examples, and they're very few because I want to move quickly. And we would love to meet with Con Ed and HRPT, and but they've made this a public relations event rather than a thoughtful scientific and legal review. So here we go. Here I am, and I have to confront them publicly. Next slide, please. Venetia said they've been monitoring and sampling, and they monitor discharge continuously for pH and temperature. Well, they didn't mention the suspended solids, oils, grease that come out of the outfall. They did not provide the whole story because they've been presenting selective data. And with selective data, I mean, I didn't want to take the last 2 months to be looking at all this stuff, but with selective data, it's misleading the public. And it's misleading the public because they like the way they operate, and DEC is allowing them to do it this way. Next. Frank, Mr. Cuomo, said the boiler operations was like a tea kettle, but tea kettles don't discharge grease, oil, selenium, lead, and chloroform. They just don't do that. Those weren't mentioned at all in the tea kettle. There's a dedicated control room. So why were there violations? Were there reporting violations? Was the person asleep, or didn't they take samples? The EPA states that if you fail to report, it may be masking serious deficiencies, quite frankly. Again, they only mentioned pH, temperature, and flow, not anything else that's coming out of that pipe. Next. They say that our claim that Con Ed operates in compliance with their permits and effluent standards. Well, on the same slide, they said that they had violated them 27 times, 26 times, sorry. So on their own slide, they refuted their statement that they operate within their permit standards and effluent standards. So they're directly contradicting themselves, which seems somewhat odd. And calling these things an administrative foul or a molehill, the EPA states failure to submit reports can mask serious deficiencies, plain and simple. Next slide. Con Ed is not returning contaminated water to the river. Like I said, Speedy's permit is an authorization to pollute. It authorizes the discharge of oil, grease, suspended solids, and all of which are conventional pollutants. And their own renewal application lists several toxic pollutants. So they can claim that they're not putting contaminated water back into the river, but they are putting polluted water back into the river. It's kind of a distinction without any real difference. Next, please. And there's just 6 notices under this. There's probably 8 or 9 that I had to edit out from our technical review people. The saying that they meet state water standards is, they're not applicable here. They have to meet clean water standards. And they've got a consistent history of violating these standards. Benicia says that toxic pollutants were identified in 1 sampling event. Well, did they do any other sampling? If they did, was it higher or lower? Or if they didn't, why didn't they do any? Just saying, well, it was only 1 sampling event. And Mr. Southwell, excuse me, I have to take a drink of water. Mr. Southwell said there's absolutely no toxic chemicals from this facility being discharged into the Hudson. Again, misleading. Because there are toxic pollutants being discharged and listed. Next slide, please. My questions for Con Ed and DEC. There have been 3 different modifications of your plant without public notice or DEC formal approval. What were they? What studies were done to assess their impact on the sanctuary? What studies were done to justify increasing the maximum temperature, which is 90 degrees in all estuaries in New York State, except for this one, which is a sanctuary? It was increased 14 degrees to 104. Why? What studies were done to justify that? It would be great if they could provide a detailed description of all this 150 analysis tests that are going to be done prior to their DEC issuing a permit for the power plant and Pier 98. And I'm very interested to know, since everything has been secret hush hush and under the pier, so to speak, if there'll be a public review or comment period before DEC issues their new permit, which I think there should be, and I believe the council might think it's a good idea too. Next slide, please. I would recommend that the city water, the drinkable water, the tea kettle stuff gets disposed of in the city sewer system rather than discharged directly into the river. That would solve one problem. I've talked to DEP. They have the capacity at North River Sewage Treatment Plant. However, they wouldn't take it with grease, oil, heavy metals, or toxins. So Con Ed might have to spend a little money to make sure those come out rather than flushing them directly into our sanctuary. It would be great if they provided all the information the public needs to make informed decisions rather than what they feel we want to hear. Next slide, please. For DEC, why haven't, I can't flash this up online and I can't do the link, but the EPA's Enforcement Compliance History Online, ECHO for short, indicates this particular facility has violations identified and has been non-compliant every quarter for the last 3 years. Last 3 years, nothing's been done to correct the situation, yet everything's fine. I mean, why hasn't Con Edison, why has Con Edison been allowed to make modifications to the plant without the public notices that are required by law or without review or approval? Again, DEC said they've already allowed 3 different changes to be made, but they assume it's always for the better of the ecosystem without any information or studies. Somehow it seems a little cozy, but who am I? And there haven't been any enforcement actions in the last 10 years, considering they got fined $5 million 10 years ago for the same things they're doing now. Seems confusing. Why has the permit renewal taken from 2016 to 2022? Confusing. DEC must be terribly understaffed. Next, please. Sorry. My recommendations for DEC. See, I'm not one to criticize without suggesting maybe there's a better way to deal with this. They should require best available technology be used at the power plant. Con Edison could install a cooling tower to reduce temperatures like you see in power plants all over the country, rather than using the river to cool their cables and return it heated. The tower doesn't even need to be in the park. If you look at the 49th Street substation, there's a very nice parking facility. Maybe it could go on their parking facility and their cars could go in a garage. Who knows? The DEC should insist that any new Con Ed permit be limited to the times of the year they operate. We just heard that they don't operate all year long. Well, their permit should be limited to the times of the year where they operate. No harm, no foul. Nobody would have a problem. Con Ed wouldn't have a problem because they don't operate outside those parameters. And DEC could be ensured that the river is protected for the remainder of the year. Con Ed stated that they only use oil from the barges about 1 week a year. And this is Tom Fox's volunteer spending the whole day putting together a PowerPoint, which I'm incompetent at doing, so there's a typo here. Why does the river have to be used for a fuel storage facility? If they only use it for a week out of the year, why don't they have a fuel storage facility somewhere else other than in the river? You wouldn't worry about leaks, you wouldn't worry about spills, you wouldn't worry about anything because it wouldn't be in the river. Next, please. Questions for the trust. Why didn't the public notice include a mention of cooling water and resulting discharges? The public notice is a couple of sentences long. Why were they included in the lease afterwards, which is like humongous? When it's inconsistent with the trust's park policies for anyone to pollute the river. Yet there's a licensed pollutant at Pier 98. And why did the Technical Advisory Committee have no idea this was happening? They put together a Technical Advisory Committee of 20 august environmental and aquatic fisheries experts to advise them. None of these people knew that Con Ed was discharging polluted, heated water into the estuarine sanctuary. As a matter of fact, it wasn't put on their ESMP, their 10-year plan for what they're going to do on the waterfront. They have all 33 combined sewer outfalls, but zippo when it comes to what's happening at Pier 98. Why the secrecy? The trust is a public benefit corporation. It's established to serve the public in a transparent manner, not to, get $1.5 million in rent to allow the pollution of the river and kind of shuffle it under the pier, so to speak. Next. The recommendations for the trust. You could let us know, and the environmental groups like the River Project, know where that 4 mil is. Because you got it from, again, my typo, Con Edison, in 2010. It should be worth $5.34 million today if it wasn't invested. If it was invested, what's it worth? And where is it on your books? I have no idea. it would really, really be helpful moving forward, because we've heard transparency at the advisory council in the past and many, many other places, is if you disseminated public notices on all your planning and policy initiatives in advance to everyone, because you seem great at sending out announcements of programs and volunteer opportunities and fundraising activities, but nothing about, well, we're planning to do this and we have designs to do that and we're changing our policies to do the other thing. I've worked with advisory committees since I forced it to be established in 1986. And they have been active, involved, informed, and helped us move this park forward. I feel like we're treated like obstacles and an annoyance rather than an asset that could be exploited. And I think we are an asset and we should be exploited, but we can't be if we don't know what's going on. If you could put the fuel upland and you could put a cooling tower in, those are things that are both expensive for Con Ed, but such is life. The estuary is priceless, they say, so expensive shouldn't be an issue. And city water, the water could be just the steam kettle stuff, could go into the city's water system, then maybe Pier 98 could be reprogrammed as a public pier. It's a whole acre in an area that has increased incredibly in terms of population. And we lost Pier 94. So this could make up for the loss of Pier 94, and Clinton could have two public piers like Tribeca and Greenwich Village and Chelsea do. The equity call. Last slide, please. Okay, we have extensive legal and technical responses. My colleague on the board of the City Club, Richard Emery, is an esteemed environmental attorney who was successful in leading us in terms of Pier 55, which resulted in a $176,000 settlement for the park. Although we had to eat a $250 million group of theaters in an estuary. Anyway, I didn't go into details, and we have a lengthy, multiple page response that I will share with Dan and Jeffrey, that they can share with their colleagues on the community board and the advisory committee. We sent our 60-day notice to Con Ed and those guys, rather than start litigation, because we thought, well, we sit down, we'll discuss it, but they've treated it as a public affairs event. You know, they're not really focused on dealing reasonably with providing a solution to what is really a problem, guys. You may think it's no problem, but a number of people think differently. And if you don't do that, this is just a fact, the party will be complicated because there'll be state and federal courts involved, which is a really lengthy process. So it really behooves all of us to sit down in a room together. We haven't heard from them in now 33 days. So if they're serious, they've obviously spent a lot of time making presentations to distract the public, rather than dealing with the technical and legal issues. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me. I'm sorry if I went on longer than I should have.
Thank you, Tom. And we're going to move on to Hudson River Park Trust. If they wanted to, do you have anything to share, Robert, or are you going to just be speaking?
I think Noreen's actually going to start us off here, and then we have Nicole and then me.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple of opening words. First is that most of you know that I've been working for the park for decades also, initially under Tom and then under 3 HRPT presidents. And one of the things that I am most proud of and that I've most enjoyed about my job over all of those years has been my ability to engage with communities and the park's engagement with communities. It's something I take very seriously. That doesn't mean, of course, that I'm not aware that there are times when there are people who would like us to say more directly or earlier in the process. Sometimes people are also disappointed when decisions are made that are not ones that they agree with, even after consultation and discussion. But right now I'm the trust president, and it's really important to me that the trust be known as a place where community conversations and considerations and opinions are taken seriously. One of my themes for our entire staff leadership is to do what we can to be proactive and engage with our local communities and stakeholders. And except in rare cases of litigation, I can't think of a time when our team has refused to talk seriously about issues, whether large or small. There are uses in Hudson River Park, particularly those that predate us or the creation of the park, that have never engendered as much curiosity as what's the park vision going to be in the future? What are our park piers going to be like? Those kinds of things. And there are uses like tunnels and vent shafts and utilities and tide gates that exist all over the park, and that the Hudson River Park Act was built around, inclusive of the sanctuary. As we've heard, the Con Ed use is one of those uses. DEC has made it clear that there's no threat to public health from the use and that they actively monitor the facility. I saw that in the chat, but that was discussed at the last meeting to ensure that the health and safety of the environment are considered as well. I will say that DEC is our board member. They're our regulator. They regulate the trust as well. They're our partner on the sanctuary management plan, and HRPT works with them constantly on all kinds of issues. And we are very confident that if DEC had a health or an environmental concern for the sanctuary, they would inform us. I know that there are some specific questions about the lease and other things like that, and I'd like to ask Nicole Catino, who is our Deputy General Counsel, to discuss that very briefly. And we'll turn this over to public discussion very shortly. Nicole?
Great. Thanks, Noreen. I just want to take a minute. I am the Deputy General Counsel at the Trust. And while I did not work at the Trust in 2011, I have reviewed the documents that we have in the Trust files from 2011. And based on my review, there was a public notice that was issued for the significant action for the Con Edison lease, the proposed Con Edison lease. Now, just to be clear, that proposed Con Edison lease was made available on the Trust website, and the public notice complied with all legal requirements for a significant action, which generally the public notice has the date and time for the public hearing, the time and the receipt for public comments, the location where the documents can be found, and then just a brief description of the public hearing. And so all of this information was made available. Like I said before, the proposed lease and the exhibits were on the website. So the public hearing in 2011, that was on April 13th, 2011 at Holland House on West 42nd Street. The hearing began at 4 and ended at 7 p.m. There was no one provided an oral comment at that hearing, but the transcript, we do have a transcript from that hearing, and it reflects that all of the Trust staff remained available for the entire 3-hour period. Now, the public comment period, the period of time where people can write in their comments and submit them to the Trust in writing, that ran from March 2nd, 2011 to May 13th, 2011, and the Trust did not receive any written comments. So one of the things I think that was raised either last week or maybe even again this evening was, what was included in the public notice and why didn't the public notice include cooling water or the heat exchanger? So I would just wanted to note that generally the purpose of a legal notice is to announce the start of a public comment period, give people the date, the location, and the time, and then provide the information. So in terms of like the content, we give you the information. In this case was a proposed lease, and you're to refer to proposed lease in order to review the lease and get the information there. The notice is actually for advertisement purposes. We publish the notice in a couple of public newspapers so people are aware that the notice is available. So we keep it very brief and very short because that's what the purpose of the public notice is for. We can't include, or it's not possible to include, everything from a 300-page lease in terms of all of the uses or all of the possible uses on the pier. And, you know, reading the public notice, of course, is not a substitute for reviewing the proposed lease or any of the other documents that we provide. I just want to take a minute and now that I've talked about the public notice, I want to turn it over to Robert Atterbury, who is our one of our executive vice presidents here at the trust. Robert.
Thank you. So one of the pieces I just want to address is the sanctuary management plan question. I know it's one that's come up a couple of times. I was not here last year when we went through the sanctuary management process, although I know many of you folks here were. And up until now, I've heard that folks were generally very happy with that process. I do oversee our river project team though, and you know, they are an incredibly dedicated group of folks who deeply care about our river. So the ESMP does specifically speak about the challenges of discharges in the river and for the sanctuary. It does focus on CSOs, which really can carry just about anything that can go down a drain into the river and are one of the frankly major concerns for the health of our river and our sanctuary. Overall, I don't want folks to stretch the ESMP into something that it is not. It's an action plan on things that we can take both alone as a trust and with partners to improve the health of sanctuary, educate people about our river environment. It's not a catalog of every possible risk from every possible source. There are discharges that are other discharges that are not listed in there, say specifically some of our boats and the risks from those sorts of things. So there are, as Noreen mentioned though, it is a living document and it is one designed to be able to respond to emerging issues. We heard about the SUNY study happening at Pier 98, and we're already trying to learn more about the work that they are doing and how we might learn from them. One of the ways that the science community really works on these things is by sharing information across panel. We are very active about sharing our information, and we really want to help bring others so that we are working holistically, because the sanctuary is not limited simply to our 550 acres or 450 acres of water, but really shared all the way across New York Harbor and up and down the Hudson. And we will be continuing to work with our technical advisory committee on the best use of resources to advance the whole of the ESMP. It is a long period. We have 9 years left in this action plan, and you know, it is something. There are a lot of great and very ambitious ideas in it, and using the resources for it is something we want to work with all of you on figuring out the best ways to do. And so I think with that, Nicole, did you have one other item or was that it? That was it? Yeah.
Okay, thanks
Thanks,
very much, Robert. So what I would like to do is open up the floor first to advisory council members, not members of the public. So if you wouldn't mind raising your hand if you have a question to ask, and direct it to one of the three parties that you'd like it answered, or if you want it to more than one party, that's appropriate as well. I see Graham's hand is raised. We'll call on Graham first.
Hi, Graham Butchell here. I'm president of the Downtown Boathouse. We used to run the free public kayaking program at Pier 96, which is 100 yards downriver from this. For 7 years, we put 69,000 people on the water, and we were never told anything. And that doesn't mean any harm was caused, but there was no interaction between Con Ed or the trust or the DEC over this discharges with the Downtown Boathouse during that period. And that's a problem for us because we're trying to build trust with the public. We're trying to convince the public that it is safe to use the harbor, even if these discharges are harmless. And I'll get to that in a second. We need to establish that trust, or it defeats the purpose of what we're doing. And we have put more than 500,000 people out on the harbour in Hudson Park since we started. So it's a big deal for us. As far as outfall number 3, which is just a heat exchanger, I don't believe it's causing any problems. It can't. It's simple chemistry, nothing coming in, going out. However, there is a concept called design for trust. Con Ed measures the outfall. It doesn't measure the intake. So it would be simple, just measure the intake. And if you've got a problem with the outfall, it's almost certainly in the intake. It is important to note that the DEC does not measure or track any of the discharges made by cruise ships. And they do dump heavy toxins in the harbor, just as they pollute the air of Midtown Manhattan, and there are no measurements taken. So whatever problems Con Ed has detected could easily have come from a cruise ship. You could look at the time of the tide and the direction of the flow, and you could probably figure it out. As far as the heat sometimes being excessive, Con Ed didn't clarify where the intake was relative to the outfall, but there are 4 slack tides a day. And if that's not designed appropriately, you could just be sucking in the water you just sent out, and that could cause problems. So some clarification there. I'm not expecting anything from outfall 3, though, to be a hazard to the public. It just can't happen. Outfall 2, I also kind of wouldn't expect, in as much as the plant runs on natural gas. Again, it's simple chemistry. Nothing coming in, nothing going out, other than what is leaching out of the pipes. But, you know, it does also run oil occasionally, and we don't know what that's all about. And there's been no discussion about the electrical plant that clearly runs in the summer and how that dissipates heat. I want to make one more comment, which is really, yes, I'm in agreement with Tom about we could use maybe some sort of heat exchanger and dissipate some of this heat into the air. But in general, cooling electrical wires is a good thing for the environment, right? It saves energy because electrical wires increase resistance as they get hotter, right? So either you have a vastly bigger plant, or you waste, literally you waste energy by heating the ground. It would be interesting if Con Ed published some data on that. There should be, depending on the amounts, there should be some significant savings, both for the environment and for consumers. But again, they're being so shy, it's not doing them any good, right? Happy to be good neighbors here, even though we're not neighbors anymore. But and I understand this is not really Con Ed's problem. This is really the trust and the DEC. Those are the government entities whose job it is to make this, to make the data available. But it's sad that people, I've met many people in recent weeks who are concerned and afraid. And quite frankly, they're not going to understand the complexity of the issues as has been presented tonight. It can be presented in a simpler fashion. It could be, you know, you could have engaged us 7 years ago, and this would never have been a kerfluffle, assuming, of course, you're not actually doing something nasty, right? So that's all I got to say.
Graham, so is there a question in there? Did you looking for a response?
Yeah, there is a question, which is really, which government entity is supposed to ensure that the public is assured about the safety of this?
Who would you like to address? Who's that being addressed?
Well, the only one government entity here, the other one's gone missing, right?
I'm happy to chime in. So DEC is the ultimate regulator for the sanctuary. It regulates all the work that the trust does in the sanctuary. It is the regulatory body for this. Federal Park Trust is not a regulatory body for public health regulatory body.
I'm not worried about the regulatory. I'm worried about who engages the public to ensure that we don't get a kerfluffle for no good reason. It must be one of those two departments.
Graham, I didn't hear your question. Could you repeat it?
So who explains these sorts of things to the public? And that's DEC. They are the ones with the information about it. The trust does not oversee this.
Okay, and they're not here. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Graham. I'm moving on to Susanna, if you could.
Yeah, sorry, I have a very quick process question, actually, because it's 8:08 and I have to jump off. Is there going to be a vote on this issue, or is this a Q&A session only?
Is the only vote would be if we want to write a letter such as Community Board 4 did, which is I imagine it would be a follow-up to this. I don't think that we're a judge and jury here. It's just, I think
Okay.
we're trying to seek information.
Okay, so there is not, because I have to jump off. I just want to make sure I don't miss anything. Thank you very
Um,
much. I'm
What I
gonna,
would like, you did ask a question in the chat before. I don't know if Con Ed, if Mr. Cuomo could put their presentation in the chat as I did, because I actually had it for Tom Fox's, but that would be helpful. That way both could see it. If you could just drag it in the chat, if it's small enough for everybody to read, I think that would be helpful.
Was that
Thank-
Susanna?
I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, it is Susanna. You
Yeah,
asked
it's
the question.
Susanna. So my two questions are, yes, I'd love to have access to the slides. And also I just wanted to make sure, since we're past the end of our normal scheduled meeting, I have to leave, that I'm not missing any important vote. Because if there is one, I need to register a vote. So thank you very much. There isn't. Thank you.
Today's meeting was published as a 2-hour meeting. It's in the agenda.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, Mary, I'm so happy you were able to join us because I thought you had an event to go to, but you had asked some questions before. So Mary is also in the executive committee of the Hudson River Park Advisory Council. Mary, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yes, we were supposed to have an event on Board Lilac tonight and we invoked our rain date. So it's tomorrow. Please join us. We're having a concert on deck with a cash bar. Anyway, my questions, because I try to stick to historic vessel issues. And the Con Ed pier is right next to one of the 3 piers that were originally designated to host historic vessels. And a few years ago, we found out, as the design finally progressed for Pier 97, that the water is actually very shallow there. I'm wondering, we've focused on the temperature more than the contamination, though we've talked about that too. With the suspended solids being deposited for decades, do we have any idea if that has contributed to the siltation that has made that pier very shallow and restricted berthing for historic ships to only 1 5-foot berth?
Is that correct?
Whoever might be able to answer that.
That's to the trust? Or-
Yes, or well, whoever might have any data. I don't think we've heard data regarding whether the solids could have caused any issues on the depth.
I have never heard of that data. There are a lot of places in Hudson River Park that have very shallow areas, so it's not unique to that location.
No, it's not.
So I suspect not. I can ask, we can certainly ask DEC if they have a sense of the volume. But I would, my instinct, given the many other piers that also have very shallow water, I would guess that that is not the most meaningful condition, even if it's partially contributory.
Did that answer your question, Mary? Or we're going to look for a
I
follow-up?
think the best we can with what we have, but I did want to bring it up. And because the historic vessel community was very disappointed, of course, when we found out there would only be 1 extremely shallow berth there. So thank you.
Okay. Next question, Jeffrey? Unmute. Yeah. There you go.
Thanks, sorry. Thanks for this. It's, I think, a question for DEC, but of course they couldn't be here this evening, unfortunately. I'm curious of water tests separate from the water that's coming out of Pier 98. We know that there are other pollutants in the river. What is the volume of those? And is the water going into 98 coming out exactly the same, quite frankly? That's something I found. We don't know what the regular test of the water looks like. And I think that would be a useful piece of comparative data here. And then, you know, CSOs have come up a lot in the chat. We talk about them very broadly, but man, think about a storm and all that runoff and how much untreated sewage gets into the water pretty regularly. And then I'll finally just say, and this is to my friend Tom Fox, who we work well together, though we disagree on a lot of things. This was a New York Times article. It is now public. And so to say that this should not be dealt with in a public manner and only sort of in closed door discussions, once the Times published a piece, I mean, I think I have to say, Tom, to your credit, we're having a transparent discussion about it. And I've learned a heck of a lot. I think a lot of my colleagues have as well. You have continued to, it was useful to hear your presentation this evening, certainly. And I look forward to learning more and continuing to be a part of the conversation here. So if I do think, I guess it's worthy in the future talking about CSOs. And if we can bring DEC to talk about those, and is that a DEC DOH conversation, I wonder, as well.
DEP also, who actually does the sewers.
Which is the city.
Thanks. Just want to let everyone know, if you look in the chat, you can take a look at a link provided by Carolyn, and it's the Con Ed presentation that we heard tonight. So I recommend that everyone copies that link and takes a look at it at some point soon. Hector, our newest member of the Advisory Council, you have the floor.
Yeah, my question is about the technologies behind the cooling. I do understand we just went through everything very quickly about how it works. I caught some of it, but I'm just wondering how old that technology is, and and if Con Edison is seeking to implement newer technologies. Well, not so new. The cooling towers that Mr. Fox had mentioned earlier seems like a really valid and good idea. And I'm kind of surprised that Con Edison, such a huge company, has not tried to implement that. And I'd like to hear the response as to why not. And also, why not take it a step further and partner up with a company that basically that provides purified water from these cooling towers. There's an MIT company called Infinite Cooling, I believe they're called. And it seemed pretty promising. They've been out for several years now, and they're getting a lot of backing. And I'm just surprised. I would like to hear why Con Edison is not looking at the ventures like that to try to improve things, so they won't, continue polluting our waterways like they're doing right now.
Dan, I can take that one.
Please.
All right.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, Hector, thank you for the question. So if I could reiterate, the question is associated with why have we not decommissioned the saltwater cooling system and gone with something kind of localized to the 49th Street substation, dedicated cooling system or cooling tower system? Is that the question?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. My response to that is, the amount of cooling that is required for those electric transmission cables is quite significant. You can engineer any kind of system, but you need space, right? So you're talking about significant amount of space at the 49th Street location. The cooling towers would be quite large. The heating efficiency or the heat removal efficiency is not as good, right? Because you're introducing air into the cooling system, whereas if you look at water to water, you're going to get higher efficiency cooling. You're going to move more BTUs for a smaller footprint and a smaller system. So it really has to do with space and the overall efficiency of the system. And as we described earlier, the current cooling system has a pretty limited impact with regards to temperature, and we're able to stay below our temperature thresholds. And the way we look at it now, it's working pretty well. And it's quite efficient for the need and the critical service that it serves. I hope that answers your question.
Well, it does in a way, but I kind of question the efficiency of it and the reasons for not building the towers, because they're used in nuclear power plants on a regular basis as a main purpose for cooling. So you're talking about high temperatures and the mass production that you guys are going through. I mean, I don't think you can get bigger than a nuclear power plant. So I like to really hear a little bit more about how you guys are proceeding with trying to seek out different ways to solve this issue instead of sticking to the old business as usual.
Yeah, no, and that's a good comment, but also note many nuclear power plants are also located on the river and also have a very similar system as far as river water cooling. In conjunction with their cooling towers as well. It really is an efficient way to cool. As soon as you start introducing air into the loop, you actually lose some efficiency just due to the capacity of the air to move heat. So that's the long and short of it. And you're talking about a significant size cooling tower, and I'm not sure anybody would be happy with putting a nuclear style cooling tower, even if it's much smaller at that location. It'd be a pretty sizable endeavor.
Okay,
Thanks for the question, though. Yeah.
Are there any other questions from advisory council members? If you're a member and you'd like to ask a question, otherwise I would open it up to the rest of our audience, the public. If members of the public would raise their hand.
Dan, I just wanted to make, it's Rob Perani, just wanted to ask a question and make a brief statement, I guess. So, number one, I just want to thank Tom and Con Ed and DEC to the extent they provide some information the other night for kind of shedding some light on this. I think it's, obviously, we care deeply at the Hudson River Foundation about the health of the river and the estuary and understanding, what's going on and having that come to light is really important. And, as a member of the TAC, I feel a certain responsibility that I didn't bring it up or think about it because it was certainly something that was known. Having said that, I think it's clear to all of us that, the context of Hudson River Park and Estuarine Sanctuary in the midst of our city means that, that's the bargain we've struck, right? I mean, there's 14 million people that live around here. There's, 1 million plus in Manhattan. I don't know how many on the Upper West Side, but close to that. And, we all depend on electricity from Con Ed. And I think we benefit from having maritime uses along the river. And, I think that's part of the bargain here. And so, it's important. I'm saying that and kind of being a little philosophical about that because I think kind of going forward, and I think there's been a bunch of good questions that have been raised both in the Con Ed presentation and Tom's statement. And, I think it's important to understand what's happening at Pier 98 in the context of all those things, whether it's, what's happening here versus other inputs into the river, what's happening here relative to alternatives and the impacts that they might have. And so I just want to sort of, I guess express concern, but temper that with, that it's something that demands perhaps some additional investigation, but also something that demands understanding the context. So, with all that as preamble, I did have one specific question, which for Venetia, or Frank, which is, what's the volume of the discharge? I think Mary had actually raised this in the chat, and I just wanted to kind of go back to that because I don't think that was in your presentation, but understanding that there's something going in the river. Maybe it's not a lot, maybe it is, but it's certainly relative to other things going in the river, not so much. But it would be good to know the volume. Thanks.
Frank, you want to take that?
Yeah, I'm trying to review my data. I know I have that somewhere, but it could be significant when the saltwater pumps are operating. You could be in the millions of gallons a day of movement, from the intake to the discharge. It could be quite significant when the system is operating, as far as overall movement.
Sure, thanks. It'd be great to get that in the future. At some point going forward.
Tom, Tom, in the New York Times article, they mentioned as much as 4 million gallons, or little as 1.3. Do you know where that figure came from? You have to unmute, Tom.
Yeah, well, I think Frank, you can, sorry.
It came from Freedom of Information requests, responses. And the total was 4.23 million, I think, of saltwater ingested in return to the river, and 1.2 million gallons of fresh water coming out of their steam facilities when they're being used. John Eisenhower, who's our technical advisor and a former Corps of Engineers district commander and chief engineer might be able to answer if he could raise his hand and you recognize him, Daniel. He has the exact numbers.
No, Tom, those are correct numbers and those are per day.
Okay, yes, all right.
Thank
So 5 million, 5.5
Sorry, who was
million
just
gallons
speaking?
a day.
Sorry, that was Frank Cuomo. So when I said millions per day, it's 4 million for outfall 3, which is a saltwater system, and 1.3 million
go.
per day for the outfall 2. But again, those are only when the systems are operating.
Well,
Okay.
and
When Mary, you don't have the floor, Mary. You're
Sorry.
gonna have the floor, but you don't have the floor right now. It's gonna go, we're gonna have Rob, then George, and then Mary, okay? So Rob Buchanan, you can unmute yourself, and then George Jackman will be next, and then after that, Mary Hapstrip.
Hi, thanks. Just a quick question. I'm hoping that we could get a response from Con Ed about Tom's suggestion that this water, this outfall 2 water be directed into the sewer and then to a sewage treatment plant, which would at least put the outfall point a long way away from the sanctuary. So just wondering what the response is to that idea.
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I don't want to speak for New York City DEP, who would be taking that water from us. I mean, I hope you would ask them this question directly, but they do not want millions of gallons of clean water in their system. DEC, you heard from DEC at the last meeting say that this water is clean, obviously going into the Hudson, and DEP would not want it in their system because it would exacerbate combined sewer overflow. I also would like to make a correction to something that Tom said about oil and grease. Just, you know, focusing on the data since 2010, we've had no violations for oil or grease. We have treatment for both of those. I don't want people to leave here with the impression that we're discharging oil and grease into the Hudson. But essentially, you should ask DEP this question, Rob, but they will tell you they do not want millions of gallons of water that DEC says is clean enough to go to the river in their system. It would exacerbate CSO. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
I agree. It is DEP that the question ought to be directed to, but since they're
Yeah,
not
yeah,
here,
yeah.
I wanted to ask you. Thank you.
Yeah, I was
And
just helping.
I've spoken to their 3rd or 4th in command who said, sure, it's possible. And that was at 11 o'clock this morning. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Tom. I'll give you an opportunity to respond after Con Ed has responded to questions if you do want to comment. George, you're next. Mary after George.
Yeah, hi, everyone. I'm George Jackman. I'm the Senior Habitat Restoration Manager for Riverkeeper. You know, Riverkeeper believes that a thriving ecosystem is beneficial. However, all the iconic fish that live in the Hudson River are in long-term decline. Species like river herring and shad are down anywhere from 95 to 99 percentile. Shad have failed to recruit for 21 of the past 22 years. American eels are down 75%. Short-nosed sturgeon and Atlantic sturgeon are both endangered species that live in the river. The reason why I say that is because human usage of the river has caused this. Human exploitation and habitat alteration has caused the long-term decline of these fishes. Anyway, Riverkeeper was asked to participate in the TAC, and I can only speak about the ecology. I'm an ecologist, and I am a member of the Hudson River Technical Advisory Committee, and part of my role was advancing the science and resource protection within the sanctuary. Again, this is a sanctuary, and as part of the TAC, I was not made aware of any hot water discharges within the park. Because in an era of climate change, the last thing we want is a warmer river water. Warm water holds less oxygen. Less oxygen makes the fish suffer. So in the summer, when the water is already warm and holding less oxygen, adding more heat is not a good idea. Adding heat in the winter is not a good idea. There is never a good time to release hot water into the river. The average river temperature in the Hudson has increased by 4 degrees Fahrenheit over the past 30 years, and summertime extremes have increased. We're getting temperatures in the 80s, in the middle 80s, and we're getting large fish die-offs because of the sewage and the lack of oxygen. Hot water discharges alter the ambient environment by creating thermal plumes that can modify physiology and behavior of migrating fish. For fish, the residence time within that plume can be problematic. The Hudson River is the engine of life and the linchpin that links marine, estuarine, and freshwater ecosystems. So this is it's the second largest estuary on the east coast of the United States. So what's the problem? Migrational delays for fish can result in grave consequences. Delaying the migration in either way is costly for the fish. They could miss the spawning event, or on the way out, they could become trapped in these thermal plumes. So during an out migration, when the young fish are trying to leave the river when they've matured enough, they could find the warm water attractive. And these thermal plumes, what happens if they get caught in this thermal plume and the ambient temperature of the river drops, they're constrained by a smaller and smaller thermal barrier. Fish that leave the plume in cold weather, they are susceptible to what's called cold shock. For us, moving from a hot tub to like cold water feels invigorating. For a poikilotherm like a fish, that could be deadly. For herrings, cold shock is 90% fatal. There has been research that has shown that plume fish communities are relatively lacking in species variety and do not support higher biological diversity of fishes compared to non-plume areas. Resource agencies and scientific studies also suggest that thermal discharges could affect aquatic life and the fish. So while warm water discharges might be considered minor by Con Ed, the synergistic and sum total of all the human assaults on the aquatic environment are quite significant. And I might add that chromium, copper, and lead are deadly in the aquatic environment, especially to fish. Copper is highly toxic to fish. That is the reason why it's one of the major constituents of boat paint, because it is toxic to aquatic organisms. So, you know, when people say it's minor to what? To minor inconvenience to human, but it could be a significant problem for migrating fish.
Thank you. George, can you wrap it up just because we're running long? So I think we get it.
When all the fish are in decline, they can't afford any more inconveniences. That's all I have to say.
So that was a statement. There's no question. Okay. Thank you, George. That helps. Mary, you have a question?
Yeah, and I had tried to jump in before just because one of my questions in the chat was being discussed. And what I was interested less in the volume per se of what Con Ed discharges than in how it might compare to the CSOs, since when Robert talked about the ESMP, he implied that it was minor in comparison. And then, so if he could answer that, and then related to that, I had asked another question in the chat about if HRPT might consider taking responsibility for consolidating data from these various agencies. So it seems sort of simple. It would just be a web page with links in most cases where we could go to for one-stop shopping and look at the data for comparison. So that's my question.
So earlier before when I was talking about it, I meant to say in terms of risk, not total volume. I can't speak to volumes. I'm not on either Con Ed or DEC side or EEP side for CSOs. So I can't speak to that, but in terms of risk, I think folks here hopefully all agree that CSOs are really a major risk because they are anything that you can put down a sewer drain can come out of a CSO. And it is sort of, there isn't the same tracking or oversight for it. In terms of that, sharing education information, we do have a lot of information on our website. We often share things from other agencies. If you actually go to our main homepage, you can see our really great water quality dashboard, which takes you to a page that talks about all the whole constituent pieces of various aspects of measuring water quality, and it links out where folks can learn more information about the specific pieces of it, and where to look at specific aspects of data. I don't know about all the other pieces of this. We can always take a look. I don't want to confuse folks though, or have piecemeal information when it really is designed to be looked whole. I know, say, DEC has a really great permit locator where you can map that you can go look up and see all the various things that they regulate and all the various aspects of it and all the various sub pieces of it, which has actually been incredibly helpful even in my own work. So, but we can always take a look. We're always trying to expand our website.
Thank you, Robert. I see Andrew Zelter, who is a member of the advisory council. You're recognized.
Thanks, Dan. And I know we're running late, so quick question. I'm curious if either as a condition of the lease or just a matter of business practice of Con Ed, do you disclose technology investments and deployments at particular sites? So if you're making an upgrade in technology or you're deploying different technology, is that a disclosure item in any respects?
So hi Andrew, this is Frank Wilmo. So any significant changes that would impact the outfalls needs to be coordinated with the DEC. So if you recall last Thursday's discussion, the gentleman from the DEC noted a number of times that we are in continuous contact with the DEC, not only to talk about issues that come up, but also plans or changes we plan to make to the system. So there is a high level of coordination with the DEC on changes.
Got it. Thank you.
Tom, you wanted to respond?
Yes, I'm sorry. I just might say that there is a high level of coordination. However, they've made 3 modifications to their plant, which required public notice and DEP approval and DEC approval. And they've assumed that those are having a positive impact on the waterway, but who knows? So they have modified their plans and DEP has not approved it yet. So they're operating with these changes without formal DEP approval.
And those approvals are expected at the end of, or pretty much in early 2023. Is that what we heard? In the last meeting at CB4, I believe.
Yes, Dan, that was regards to the permit that the DEC was discussing. But I did want to make one note, if I'm allowed. Dan, it's up to you.
Of course, yes.
Tom, just one thought there is that, we are a public regulated utility on the electric, gas, and steam side. We cannot make any significant investments at our locations without going through public due process regarding rate cases. So a lot of our projects are very well descripted during that process. While it may not get to the level of detail that you're hoping for, a lot of these enhancements have been discussed over the years as part of the rate case. And our most recent modification was a water quality upgrade at the station that would improve the filtration and demineralization of the water. And again, that was discussed and reviewed in the rate case proceedings and approved. So that is a public transaction.
The phrase is rate case, the case for rates, right?
Yes,
rate case.
And that's done. And you said it was done annually.
No, that is done as needed.
Okay.
Thank you. And
just
what
letting
happens?
us at the point that it's public, right?
Yeah, it's part of public record is my point. And we're not allowed to make significant investments without that process.
John Eisenhower. Tom,
no problem.
Thanks. Because I just don't want to go back and forth. I don't think it helps us. Thank you. John Eisenhower.
Thank you. I just had a question of clarification for Mr. Cuomo. Earlier in the presentation, he mentioned in discussing outfalls 003 that they discharge only in the summer months and only for 118 consecutive days per year. I'm just curious, I'm asking because in February of this year, they reported discharges, and then in June. February is not a winter month and it's not consecutive with June. As well, over the past several years, it appears they've operated in at least 6 months per the reporting to EPA. Could he clarify?
Could you, before you clarify, John, can you identify if you're from an organization? I don't recognize your name. Are you from an organization, or are you a public, just a member of the public?
As Mr. Fox noted earlier, I'm helping provide some regulatory guidance.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Can you actually restate the question? I want to make sure I heard it correctly before I respond.
Sure. Early in the briefing, you presented that out of outfall 003, the thermal discharges only occurred in summer months for 118 consecutive days. The DMR for 2022 reflect discharges from that outfall in February and June. February is not a winter month and is not consecutive with June. So I'd ask that you clarify what you presented to this body.
Yep. No, thank you for the question. So when we presented 118 days, that is the average annual operation. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. If it's outside of that summer period, like if it occurs in a February, March, or some other month outside of that period, normally we would do testing on the system to prepare it for the summer. And it could be that. But normally if it's outside of that window, John, it has to be associated with system testing or some type of review of the system to prepare it to make sure we're in full operation for the summer.
I'll recognize you, Tom.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've forgotten my response, so don't worry about it. Let's have a good night.
Okay. Does anyone else from the public or from the advisory council have a question?
Mr. Eisenhower, you provide technical assistance, regulatory conversations to the City Club. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Just for identification purposes in my notes.
That's correct.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks everybody for a really engaging conversation. I believe my recommendation after hearing this is to continue the conversation, to write a letter requesting a continuing of the conversation, doing our best to maybe put together a letter that I would circulate first to the executive committee and then to the advisory council at our next meeting, which would be the second Tuesday of the month in October. Although it is Columbus Day, but it's the day after. If that doesn't work for folks, I might just move it one more week. But the idea is I think it's very important for us to have an October meeting to continue to follow this up but not get into too many more specifics, but just make our elected officials understand that there are questions that are still maybe unanswered. And to put together a letter. And I would love also, Jeffrey, to see, take a look at the guidance of CB4 and what they're writing, somewhat following that that template. It's proved successful with the bikeway, and it might prove successful here. It seems like all the parties are willing to speak. Do you have any comment on that, Jeffrey? Yep, you agree? Okay, great.
Yes.
I don't need to see hands. Does anyone disagree with that approach? Anybody on the council feel like a different approach should be taken? Raise your hand if you believe, and I'll give you the floor. Seeing no hands, the motion. Does somebody want to second the motion of writing a letter?
Second.
Okay, I see Isaac Daniel as well. Okay, the motion passes. That will be our next steps. I don't think we're going to get onto anything that is at the bottom of the agenda because they're just not that important. We spoke about the viability study. Pier 34, we can move to the next meeting. That was really Tammy Melser's, the CB1 chair's item, and she's not here with us today. And I look forward to the committees reconvening. Is there anyone from historical resources or from DEI, that would be you, Michael, that you want to talk about next steps for your committees, anything that I can do to help to keep the conversation going.
I have a conversation about that I'll talk to you directly about and with my committee. We will call a meeting between now and the next full meeting. And I'll reach out to Robert Atterbury as well. Okay? Thank
Great,
you.
perfect. And then Mary, I imagine safety will reconvene as well. So I see Lynn Funk's hand is up.
Yes, historic resources is available for any tasks after we submitted our information on Gansevoort Market area.
Thank you, Lynn.
And Mary Hapster, you still with us?
Yes, I just put a note in the chat to save time, but we have nothing particular to report from safety right now.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone. It was a little bit over, but only 15 minutes, so that's not terrible. Thanks everyone, especially Tom and Frank, and as well as Venetia, and Noreen and Robert, and the deputy
Nicole.
Nicole, who I met, I think, for the first time tonight. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you especially to Michael Wiggins.
Who has one final question?
Who's taking notes for us.
That committee, historic what?
Resources.
Historic resources. And your report was you had nothing big to report except?
We're just open for new tasks after Gansevoort Peninsula input.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
And the trust had advised us or asked us to move to Pier 97 because it was the next pier under construction, which is why I got caught in this whole mishigas while I was up there trying to think of what we should say and saw the pipe. So I got a little distracted.
I think we're blessed with so many experts on the river. I am not. I just like to go in the river. But thank you all for joining us. And does somebody like to make an motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Yes, see, so moved. Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone. And I'll be circulating back with our next step letter. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Adjourned.
Thank you all.
All right,
Bye.
everyone.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.